Okay, so we're going to get started. So again, welcome. I'm really excited to talk about this topic of habits of mind because when I'm in the schools, as many of you know, I'm a director here at Inspired, but I'm still in the schools quite a bit doing consulting, coaching, working with administrators. And I would say probably 99% of the concerns or problems that I'm faced with and presented with can really all come back to habits of mind. So we're going to learn today a little bit more about what that means, what they are, and how we can get started on integrating them into our daily instruction. Okay, so first off, my name is Michelle Regan. For those of you who don't know me, like I said, I am a director here. I've been in education for 25 plus years. My background is special education, and I think this is an area I'm passionate about because my view of education is we should be helping kids to be independent. We should be getting them set up for the rest of their lives. And so habits of mind are really just that. They're real life behavior and skills that kids will apply in the classroom, in the school building, as well as outside in the real world today and in their future. Okay, so what do you expect to get today? The takeaway should be that you can answer these three questions. So you should be able to define what are the habits of mind. We want you to be able to answer how can we set kids up for success, as well as how to get started. Okay, so you should be able to leave today knowing those three things. Okay, so I want to start with this idea that, especially in education today, we know that the most important thing that we ask teachers to do in their daily practice is to set high expectations for students. And I believe in this wholeheartedly, that no matter where students come from, what their background, what trauma they've experienced, how successful they or their families are, we need to set high expectations for everyone. So that being said, um, it doesn't stop there. Kids are not going to be successful just because we decided that we have these high expectations. Without the scaffolding or support or skills to get there, kids are going to experience just as many problems as they do now. So what does that mean? Are we going to give kids a rope or a ladder? I like to think about this analogy in terms of how we help kids to meet those high expectations. Okay, so when I think about giving them a rope, one of two things might happen. So you throw them a rope and they have no idea what to do with it. And you're basically saying, here, figure it out. Okay, so I've set these high expectations for you. Now you have to figure out how to get there. Okay, probably not successful. The other thing when I think of as a rope is as the teacher, we're the ones pulling them along, right? So in the classroom, we're providing such levels of structure or, rote responses that students are just literally pulled along. Now, whether they're successful or not, or whether they've actually learned the material or not, or learned how to think, is sort of besides the point in these instances. So the teacher, the administration are pulling these kids along, passing them on to the next grade. You'll hear things like, well, we covered the content, but kids are not going to be successful that way. So I like to think of giving kids a ladder. Okay, so think about the habits of mind, we're going to dive in a moment, as the rungs of the ladder. If you give kids a ladder, all they have to do is bring it with them wherever they go and put it up against that wall and start climbing up to those high expectations. Okay, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but if they have those skills and those habits, they'll be able to apply it wherever they go. Okay, that being said, what are the habits of mind? You've heard me mention them several times. So these are really the mental abilities that we fall back on when we're faced with a challenging situation. So this could be a challenging situation in academics. This could be social situations. This could be just dealing with everyday life things that come up that can be frustrating or can maybe be a setback. Okay, people who are successful in any and all fields use these habits, even though they don't call them the habits of mind. Okay, and we can look again across generations, we can look across fields to see people who are successful because they have developed these skills. What are they? So what specifically are these skills? Don't worry, you don't need to see this. This is a little bit blurry. You don't need to read the tiny print. I'm going to do that for you. But the 16 different behaviors are various skills that can be considered isolated skills, but also can be considered ones that may work together nicely or in clusters. And really, all of these 16 skills support the things that we're wanting in our 21st century schools. So we're wanting kids who are good communicators, who can collaborate with their peers, who are resilient, can have good citizenship, solve problems. So all of these things that we know that are really what we are called to give to kids, or to create in our schools, these habits of mind are going to directly contribute or impact those. And the other thing I like to think about in this way is that all of the standards that we're faced with on a daily basis are content standards, ELA, math practices, the new, in New Jersey, the new social emotional learning competencies, the 21st century learning standards. All of these can work in tandem, can work together. Habits of mind should not be considered an add-on. Okay, and that's really, really important that we think of it that way, because when you're sharing this with your teachers, they need to see it as something that's integral to making all of these other things happen. Okay, if kids are going to be successful on the math practices, if they're going to be meeting the social emotional and the 21st century standards, these all work together. Okay, so we're going to dive into each of the standards, but before we do, I'm sorry, not standards, habits. But before we do, I'd like you to think about your own students. Okay, take a minute and consider what areas as we go through might be difficult for them. And then which of these habits might really support their growth. Okay, could they really, really use in the classroom and in life? So I'm going to dive into the 16 habits, and I always want you to be coming back to who's in my classroom, who's in my building, how might this help them? Okay. All right, so we're going to look at these in groups of 4. So the first set looks at persisting, and you'll note that after each of the habits, there is a little phrase followed by an exclamation point in most cases. And you can use those phrases as a way to sort of a shorthand when you're discussing this with teachers and students. So at the end, we're going to talk about how do I get started. But this is one thing to keep in mind is we want to make sure that kids and teachers are clear on what each of these mean, but we want to also make it simple. So think about using these little phrases as a way to introduce them and promote them with your school building. Okay, so persisting, sticking to it, persevering on a difficult task, remaining focused. We'll talk about these a little bit more as we go forward, but I want to get through all 16 first. Okay, listening with understanding and empathy, understand others. So does a student take the opportunity, the time required to not only let somebody else speak, but take on their point of view? Okay, really important, we know, in today's culture for so many reasons. Thinking about your thinking or metacognition. I think many schools are aware of the importance of this, but I wonder, and I often, when I'm visiting classrooms, I don't think I see enough of the thinking aloud that's required to help students understand that they should constantly be revisiting, how did I get that answer? What strategies did I use? Thinking about my own thoughts and feelings and actions and their effect on my work and on other people. And questioning and problem posing. I think since the coming of the Common Core, I think we're doing more of this in classrooms. I think we're, especially through the sciences and doing more work with data, I think we are asking students to create questions and to pose problems. But again, I don't know that they're super high quality. I think we're at the very beginning of beginning stages here, and we want kids to really embrace the idea of constantly asking different questions, new questions, and not being content with the first answer given. We want to delve a little deeper. Okay. So thinking and communicating with clarity and precision. Be clear. I think about this. I know that this is a math practice, but an example that I think about is students today with technology and with texting. So much of how they communicate, written and orally, whether it's text, on paper, on the computer, I feel like can be extremely vague, general, um, even, certainly lacking precision. So I think it's something that is really a critical piece that happens in the coming years. I have taught college, and my students, I've seen a big change in them over the past 10 years, their ability to communicate clearly and accurately. So I think that's something that's really got to take center stage in the coming years. Innovating, so creating and imagining and innovating. So this idea of try a different way. Again, with the onset of the Common Core and the next generation assessments, students are really being asked to give the quote unquote best answer. And that could be, or best choice, and that could be multiple. So they might be asked to provide two best pieces of evidence, for example, out of a series of 6 or 8. So kids really need to be able to come up with new and novel ideas and put their own originality into their thinking. Taking risks. I think this idea of venture out, you can think of it as thinking outside the box. And really, if any of you are familiar with growth mindset, this idea of learning from mistakes, I think, is critical. Kids are not going to become risk takers if they're fearful of failing. Okay, so our classrooms need to be places where we really embrace mistakes, celebrate those failures as stepping stones to our progress. So a really important one. Okay, and the fourth one here is thinking interdependently. So much of the new standards require students to be able to work together. If kids have not had experience, or at least not good experiences, this is going to be, can be very, very contentious and certainly unsuccessful. So kids really need to learn how to do these things, how to collaborate. This is not an inherent skill. They have to be taught. And that being said, I want to stop myself there. I should have said from the beginning, because I did receive some questions from those who couldn't attend today, and they sent in their questions. One of the questions I had was, can these be taught, or are these skills that kids, or traits that kids need to come to school with? No, the habits of mind can all be taught. And there's various ways that we're going to go about doing it. But we don't want you to look at these habits and think that kids are supposed to come with these, and that if they don't have them, they're never going to get them. Okay, managing impulsivity. When I walk into buildings, this is something that I constantly hear from teachers, is that kids are just shouting out, and they're getting up and moving around, and they're unable to control their impulses. So we want to really establish this idea of taking your time, being thoughtful, delaying gratification. We're up against technology now that is immediate. And we can't, just ban that from our classrooms. We have to embrace that, but figure out what is a way that we can work, symbiotically, that yes, technology can get us what we need right away, but how can we also, in the appropriate times, delay gratification, take our time, think before acting. Thinking flexibly, I sort of touched on this before when I mentioned that idea about the two best choices. We really need to be able to generate new alternatives, think about different points of view. Many times when I mentioned about group work being unsuccessful, these two go hand in hand, because if kids feel like it's either my way or the highway, then we know that certainly that group work is not going to be successful. So this idea of thinking flexibly is critical. Okay, striving for accuracy, similar to communicating with precision. We really want kids to do their work and go back to their work and check it and improve it. And I have to say, again, this is something that I have seen decrease in the past 10 years that I've been working with college students, they want to be done. They just want to be finished. And I think technology, because we're on a computer and it's fixing our errors for us, it sort of promotes this idea that we're not going back and checking our work and trying to improve it. And so this is something that, again, I think we need to be very explicit in our teaching and our instruction, and also in that we want kids to internalize this, that this is really an important life skill as they go out into the real world and try to get jobs and be successful. Okay. Applying past knowledge to new situations. I think this is something as educators we try to do all the time, but we may need to just be a little bit more explicit about it and have kids be explicit of when did you use this last? What's another time that you learned something similar, so that they can have those experiences and they can make them visual, make them verbal, make them known. Okay, and our last 4, gathering data through all of our senses. So much of what we do now in the classroom is related to data in some way, not just math, not just science, but even in ELA, we're talking about evidence, right? So kids should be really used to this idea of paying attention to the world around me, paying attention to what I'm reading, what I'm touching in an experiment, okay? Remaining open to continuous learning, knowing that I think of this very similar to the idea of failure and making mistakes, that I have more to learn, that it doesn't end here. Just because I finished chapter 2 doesn't mean I'm done with this concept. Okay, finding humor, I think we could, in the appropriate places, all use a little bit more of this, right? And just being able to laugh at yourself, being able to recognize that, again, when we make those mistakes or we take a risk and it doesn't work out, that's really okay and part of the learning process. And lastly, responding with wonderment and awe, being excited, finding things, being curious, being intrigued by things. And I think that certainly plays into much of what we do in the classroom. We want kids to be more engaged. We want the learning to be relevant. And so I think that fits in nicely. Okay, by now I've completely overwhelmed you with these 16 different ideas or concepts. Hopefully, as we were going, and you're certainly invited to use the chat feature, hopefully you've been thinking about your particular students and the areas that they may struggle with, and the areas that you think, wow, they could really use these habits to be able to experience success. So I'm just going to give you a minute, and if you're jotting down notes, you may want to jot down, you know, the 1, the 2, the 3 that come to mind when you're thinking about your own students. Okay, and like I said, if anyone wants to add to the chat, feel free. Okay. All right, so we're gonna, now that you've jotted down or taken a moment to think about your own students and where they might struggle and what they could use to succeed, I want to give you a real life task to think about. This might help it come into view a little bit better. So I think about this idea of a house of cards. It's an activity that I did all the time growing up. It's an activity that I did with my kids when they were younger. And I want you to think about this activity. If you did this in your classroom or even with your staff, where would they struggle? What would happen? What would it look like? Okay, I imagine that there would be some kids that might be frustrated, some kids that would give up very easily. There might be other kids that really struggle with working with a group and taking turns, and you might see a house of cards that continues to fall or get knocked over because there are kids who are just not listening to their peers and just going ahead and doing. Okay, there are going to be other kids that are going to say things like, what's the point? This is boring. There's going to be no sense of that curiosity or open to learning something from this. Okay. What habits of mind specifically, if you were doing this activity, do you think you would use? Okay, I'll give you a minute to think about those and to take if you took notes before, to think back to those 16 habits. The ones that jumped out to me were persisting. When it falls, I would want to go back and try again. Um, would I listen to others? I think if someone is saying, no, we should do it this way, then maybe I need to sit back and listen. Also, I think metacognition. So what about this idea that I've tried to do it the same way 3 times and it hasn't worked? So I'm thinking about, okay, well, maybe I need to try a new strategy. So that being said, how would these particular habits help your students? Okay, if a student has an opportunity to practice persisting at a task like this, where would that help them in the classroom? Where would that help them in their academics? How would that help them later in life? Okay, so I just used this example, but I want you to really, when we're thinking about habits of mind after today, think about the everyday tasks that kids may encounter where they're really going to need these skills. And even though this particular task is obviously contrived, it mimics very much real world opportunities that kids may have, where they may become frustrated and give up easily and not listen and not collaborate or be impulsive. Okay. Okay. I wanted to put a little disclaimer here because again, this goes back to the question that I had earlier, and certainly the something I hear all the time, and that is, shouldn't these kids come to school with these habits? Kids these days aren't the same as they used to be. Okay, well, whether that's true or that's not true, and that's another workshop, I think it's really important to understand that we cannot assume that kids are going to come to school with these skills. They may or may not be developed at home. And why that might be, again, is a completely different workshop, but these skills are hard for students and for adults. So that being said, if kids are coming from a home where the parents or the adults in their lives do not have these skills, then clearly we can't expect the kids to come to school with these habits. Okay, so we sort of want to put that out of our head as a reason or an excuse to not engage kids and teach them the habits of mind. Okay, how do we start? I told you would leave here with knowing how to start. We're going to walk through a series of questions. So there's 3 steps, and at each step, you're going to think about these particular questions. So first is to reflect. The adults in the building need to think about, which habits of mind do I regularly use? Okay, so if I am one of those people that's really good at persisting at tasks, or I'm really careful to be precise in my communication, we want to identify those. Which ones do I use regularly and are my strengths? Okay, and then next we want to think about which ones maybe do I need to develop. So I'm going to throw myself out there and use the example of controlling impulses. When I am in a group, I am excited about what I'm doing and talking about. And so I'm also often impulsive in sharing my thoughts and ideas. That's something that I need to think about and need to work on, because the whole point of this slide is to set you up to model for your students. Okay, so if I personally cannot model controlling impulses, it's going to be problematic for my students, right? So I really want to consider myself first. So when you go back to your buildings after today, I want you to think about sharing this with your staff. The first step would be self-reflection, asking them to consider these things. Okay, moving on to step 2 is really assessing the students in your classroom. What is it that we're currently seeing students do and say? You heard me mention several times that when I was teaching with my college courses, I was seeing very specific behaviors. I was seeing students hand in work without checking it over. I was seeing students be having real difficulty with collaboration and group work. Okay, so you want to really document what it is you're currently seeing. And then you want to think about, in order for kids to be successful, what specific thinking skills do they need? And along that line, how can I teach them? So we talked about modeling. Clearly, you want to model it, but you don't want to do it in a way that's subtle, where kids have to guess. Again, we want to give them that ladder. We want to be very, very clear and transparent. So I want to be able to use a think aloud model and share with them. Right now, I would love to dive in and try a different way with that house of cards, but I'm going to wait and I'm going to listen and try to understand my group mates, and I'm going to control my impulses, and I'm going to give them a turn. Okay, so we really want to use the think aloud and help kids to see what skills and strategies am I using. Okay, and then also you want to consider other ways. Do we need to provide kids with more opportunities? Maybe they don't have enough opportunities. Maybe group work happens, twice a month. Clearly, kids are not going to have the opportunity to practice and to fail and to then progress, right? And so the final piece of this assessment slide is, at the end, decide 3 or 4 habits that you want the students to develop. You cannot go in and say, I'm going to do all 16 habits of mind. Not possible, won't be successful. Instead, identify those habits, those 3 or 4 habits that you think is going to directly impact that first bullet of what you're seeing them do and say that probably needs to be adjusted. Okay, so once you have those 3 or 4 habits, the third step is to make a plan. And so I think the first and most critical is to ask yourself, what are the opportunities where these will come to life in your student's mind? So how will it be relevant? What can help them outside of school? I think this is really, really important. So I have an example of a friend of mine. Her son really struggled in school, has ADHD, needs to have a fire lit under him to get going. And she kind of threw him to the wolves and got him a job at a bagel store where he had to work at 6 in the morning rush, keep up with it. And it was very interesting. He really had some kind of nice self-awareness and figured out that, wow, these things were difficult for him, but that with practice, he was able to develop these skills. So that's just a little example of how, for kids, we have to make it relevant to them. It could relate to their sports teams. It could relate to their family relationships, especially as they get older, okay? Then we want to consider, what are the routines, the classroom routines and procedures that you already have that you can tweak to include these habits. Okay. And then third is, how can they be integrated into the existing curriculum? So again, we don't want people to be overwhelmed that this is an add-on. Okay. So speaking of curriculum and the content, this is an example, obviously, from mostly ELA, some social studies, but the idea is just start with your content. Where is there natural places, or we can call them like tuck-ins, that make a lot of sense? So in literature, I can give examples of characters who are exemplifying these habits. In current events, in the phenomena we study in science, what's required, in math with the math practices. So we really want to think about our content and what is already there as prime learning opportunities. Okay. Then we go into those instructional routines and strategies. What already exists in my classroom? Or what tweaks or changes can we make? So I gave some examples here. If any of you are familiar with Ask 3 Before Me. So as students are working independently, they are instructed to ask 3 peers if they need assistance, if they need clarification, before they come to the teacher. So we're really trying to develop these skills of certainly communication skills, but also that we're not going to rely on the teacher to give me a rope and pull me along, but instead I'm going to work to be independent. Okay, and an instructional routine of morning meeting. You're providing a prime opportunity for students to experience empathy, listening with understanding and empathy, thinking and communicating with clarity and precision, right? There's lots of different habits that can be easily interwoven into a morning meeting. And if you have upper grades and this isn't possible, there are other ways that you can do a simple check-in the first 3-5 minutes of class. Okay, accountable talk. If you've seen that term used, it's really having kids be able to ask those questions when they're having group discussions. So things like, I agree with you because, or I see it another way. Okay, there are different accountable talk stems that can be used in the classroom. And again, we're really supporting a couple of different things. Thinking flexibly, thinking about, you know, thinking interdependently, okay, and a great way to incorporate some of these habits. And certainly cooperative learning or any kind of structured group work is going to allow for opportunity to practice these. So I want you to think about the instructional routines and strategies in your own classroom or in your building that you think could be tweaked just a little bit to include these. Okay, we're getting ready to wrap up. I know our time is short, but just some ideas about the types of instructional activities, lessons that you can construct for your students so that they can really tap into the habits of mind. Okay, so you've selected the content, you've thought about the thinking skills required, but now what tasks have you created for the students? So things that involve strategic thinking or long range planning. Can they do a group work that is going to require multiple steps where they're going to have to plan over the course of 3-4 weeks? Okay, what about designing something new, creating a new product? Making decisions, thinking about, okay, well, this material didn't work. Can I try something else? Okay, resolving discrepancies. So if there's conflict in a group, how are we going to go about resolving that? Clarifying any confusing information, asking questions, conducting research. So these are just some examples of tasks that can be planned across the curriculum. Okay, these can be woven in. And again, we want to be very, very strategic in how we plan so that we are giving kids the actual skill development. We're giving them the scaffolding required. We're not just saying, hey, make a long range plan, but we're giving them the tools that they need to do so. Okay, there's much more to our Habits of Mind workshop, but obviously in a 30-minute webinar, we can't cover everything. If you have questions, this is a great time to put them in the chat feature. I'm also going to be following up with everybody individually to see if this did answer your questions, if you have individualized questions or concerns. Obviously, this is only an introduction and an overview. What this looks like if we were to come to your school is we provide a full training with how exactly is it rolled out in the classroom with teachers. So we talk about what you would do with students to roll it out, and then what you would do further along to follow up as you go throughout the year. Okay, with specific examples and hands-on activities for the teachers. So I hope today was really useful for you to learn a little bit more about what habits of mind are, why they're so important in setting kids up for success, and how to start, right? So again, I will follow up with everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I don't see any questions popping up on my screen, so I'm hoping that that means that I answered a lot of your initial thoughts and questions about this. Please join us for our next webinar. We're going to be doing these monthly. And just so that you know, next month, we're going to be doing these starting at 3:30 in the afternoon. We'll be sending out our newsletter and our emails to let you know, but we decided that the 10 o'clock slot didn't work for a lot of people, so we're going to move it to 3:30 so that you have some flexibility. And certainly we have the recording, So I'm going to send that recording off to you after today as well. Thank you again for learning a little bit more about the habits of mind and how Inspired can come in and get your staff rolling. Thanks so much.